This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. This evening, I am joined by Ross Palethorpe. How's it going, Ross?
It's going great. Thank you for having me back. It's always a good time to talk about some weird art.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, on top of the normal mild content warning that goes in the intro, I do want to just caution people a little bit. I don't know how deeply we'll necessarily get into it, but we are talking about a book today, and the book is gnarly. We're talking about a book called The Wasp Factory by a Scottish author called Iain Banks. And if you are going to go and read this book for yourself, content warning for almost anything that you could have a content warning for, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Violence, body horror.
Yeah, I don't know that
themes.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's done in service of themes, and I will say I don't know that anyone commits sexual violence really.
That's true. Yeah.
It's kind of there's autonomy stuff that goes on, but basically anything else that you could have a content warning for. It's a heck of a book. Yeah, and so I mentioned this on Blue Sky as being one of those seminal books that really, I think it was the first time that I really understood the power of what a book can do. And so I'll set the scene a little bit. So The Wasp Factory is the first novel by Iain Banks, which I imagine a lot of listeners may be more familiar with under the science fiction that he wrote as Iain M. Banks. And it came out in 1984, and it's not a big book at all. And it is, I read it I read it in 2000. I'm actually about the same age as the protagonist, which is important for reasons that will become clear shortly. And at the time I was in high school, and we had been given this, we had to write a big book report as part of our equivalent of sort of year 12 English. And my English teacher at the time was a lovely guy called Mr. Brown, one of those teachers that I will always remember for various reasons. And he gave us this big long list of books as possible things to read. So I, being a very conscientious student, went through and read as many as I could, and that was introduced me to A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn. I read Primo Levi. Whoopi Goldberg was on there for some reason, but couldn't find a book that really stood out. And I was in Johnston Library on the west coast of Scotland and came across this book and got it out of the library and brought it to my English teacher and went, "Do you think this would be a suitable book for a book report?" And he laughed and said, "Actually, I know Iain. Yes, didn't have content warnings back in those days." He said, I think you'll get a lot out of it. And I think I read it in one go, which I have done every time since. And it is the first book that horrified me so much. I remember a distinct point in the book where I was so blown away by it that I remember distinctly, I threw it across the room. Yeah, there is a sort of singular hinge point of horror quite close to the end of the book, and that thoroughly did my head in for a while, because I think I got my hands on it because my dad had a copy in his collection of books, and my parents just had a big bookshelf of all of their books in the living room, so it was just always accessible to me and my brother. And I would probably have been the same age as you when I read it for the first time. And I've talked to my dad about it. He wasn't a fan. He didn't like it much, and he didn't really connect with it. But I think he must have bought it because he'd heard that this Iain Banks guy was kind of a big deal, and he wanted to be kind of, abreast of what was happening, particularly in Scottish writing. And I just picked it up completely sight unseen. And when I got to that kind of pivotal turn, absolutely. That stuck in my head forever, basically. Yeah.
And I remember I read it and went back to my English teacher the next day, and he said, what did you think? And I went, it's the most disgusting thing I've ever read, and I can't wait to write about it. And he found that very funny. And my one very minor claim to fame is that he actually told Iain, and who found that very amusing, that some spotty 16-year-old on the West Coast was writing about the themes of his debut novel. So the novel is it set in the 80s? Like I was rereading it, and I sort of assumed it was early 80s, given the ages of people involved.
Yeah, I feel like it's either, because it came out in 84, and I feel like it's either set slightly earlier in the 80s or maybe right at the end of the 70s. Frank, the protagonist, goes to punk gigs in a little semi-rural Scottish pub, and that the depiction of the kind of punk scene that he's talking about feels very early 80s, late 70s to me.
Yeah. So, but that's the thing. It has a certain timelessness to it. There's moments where Frank, our protagonist, who's a 16-year-old boy, meets other people. He lives a very secluded and sheltered life, and he lives with his dad, who's this very strange, very distant character who starts off seeming mildly eccentric, and by the end is an absolute monster. And as the book continues, and we learn, it's all told from Frank's perspective, you get this idea of an inner life that is incredibly warped. The themes of alienation, of what imagination can do in the worst possible way. And he talks about how he's killed three people before he reached the age of 10. And the most gruesome, he describes these murders in a very calculating, it's a really interesting, he's an unreliable narrator. He's pathologically awful, but Banks does such a great job throughout of that you feel for him.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, he's an unreliable narrator, and he says some quite repulsive stuff, but Banks has a gift of giving him this very personable voice, and also he is very matter of fact about all of the things that he's done. So he's an unreliable narrator, but he's not an unreliable narrator in the sense that he's necessarily trying to hide his crimes or make himself look better. He's telling you why he did them from his point of view, and the way in which he planned them and carried them off. And one of his, I suppose, kind of admirable qualities is that he's exceptionally methodical and organized and focused. And so he does have this very practical perspective on why a person needs to die and then how you should go about it.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that really captured me when I've read it multiple times since, and most recently in preparation for this episode. And I've read a lot of books with unreliable narrators. I've read a lot of books with protagonists who are deeply unpleasant. But there's something about Frank that has really stayed with me. And I think the isolation that he feels, and the he lives in this dilapidated old house on the east coast of Scotland, on this little island next to this, near this little town. There's heaps of them throughout Scotland. I could really picture it. And having spent a bit of time on the East Coast myself before I moved across to Glasgow, it's very steeped in that place. I could really picture it in my head. I could imagine the people that he meets and that he sort of interacts with, and the connection that he has. But the way that connection with place is so warped by, he kills small animals. He enacts these terrible acts of violence and very odd rituals and things. And the thing that I got from it this time around, reading it in my 40s and as someone who's worked with young people for a long time, is that the loneliness that he feels that's been curdled into this ritualistic need for violence and all of the strange things that he does, which in his head, he says multiple times throughout the book, I'm completely sane. It's my older brother, Eric, who's crazy. Everything I do has a purpose, but compared to my brother, I am absolutely, everything I do makes sense. And from his perspective, he's right, they do. But the terrible acts of violence, horrifying stuff.
Yeah, that thing about his singular perspective is really interesting, because I guess that was a thing that really drew me into the book, because I was a weird kid who didn't make friends easily, and so I wasn't torturing small animals and building a complex internal magic system which required lots of tiny corpses or anything like that. But I did have this very complicated, very strange, very, very intense internal life that I had a hard time sharing with people my own age, because I didn't really get on with a lot of them. And that sense of being kind of locked in your own head and turning it all quite weird, that he really captures that, and that is a very particular experience,
Yeah, and this is why I think it's one of these books that really it's not for kids. Oh God, no, absolutely not. My son saw me reading it and he said, "Oh, could you read some of that to me?" And I said, "Absolutely not."
No,
this is
no,
getting
no.
hidden away on a top shelf until you're old enough. But it's a very strange, maybe not inverse, but it's like a darker version of A Catcher in the Rye, I guess, which is another book that I read as part of that summer of reading for this report that I did, which I didn't connect with at all. I hated the protagonist. I didn't get what it was trying to tell me, but the way that Banks writes about what it's like to be a lonely 16-year-old kid and then takes that to these incredible extremes is so relatable. There's a part of it that feels almost idyllic. This kid he's got some access to money and resources. He spends it all on crossbows and stuff to make pipe bombs, and he cuts all of the labels out of his clothes. I remember reading that at 16 and thinking, God, if I had a pair of Timberlands like he does, I wouldn't do that. But that real freedom that he has, which I think is so alluring as a teenager, and what he does with it, which is horrifying, but there is that relatability. And then you look at it as an adult, and the sadness that I felt reading it as a parent now and going, God, where are the adults in his life? And then at the end, when you find out what exactly his dad has been doing to him all this time, it's really heartbreaking in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had two thoughts about that. One of them was that you used the word idyllic, and before we hit record, I was saying that the thing that had come into my head reading it this time around was when I was a kid, I was obsessed with Arthur Ransom's Swallows and Amazons books, and this time around read to me as kind of an evil version of those. They both have this sense of sort of unsupervised youth, free to kind of make what they want out of nature. And they have this whole thing about, renaming places and things to something that fits the sort of epic scope of their own imaginations. But Frank, of course, is doing it in this very destructive, very evil way. Also, I think the thing that feels very, I guess, late 70s, early 80s about the book, and which didn't really connect for me until this go through, is all of the signifiers of sort of hippie utopianism in his dad. Like, it's not just a dilapidated house. It's a dilapidated house with the remains of what used to be a psychedelic paint job. And he repeatedly refers to his dad as an old hippie. And the sort of hints you get about his mother and the kind of passing anecdotes are very like this particular kind of hippie pop feminism idea. And so you could sort of read the book as a critique of that generation's attempt to remake the world in some ways, I think.
Yeah. And I think the sort of dark inverse of that very, again, this idyllic ideal of, kids should spend more time outdoors, and in my day they did X, Y, and Z, and we have the, certainly of my generation and growing up with, there was all the Enid Blyton books, and there was this idea that the kids just ran around solving mysteries and going on adventures, and it was all very jolly hockey sticks. And the sort of flipping of that to this kid is going out and torturing animals and setting up these terrifying, what he calls these sentinels, these poles that look out around the island to keep it safe, that are mounted with the heads of dead animals and smeared in his own bodily fluids and things. And this real sort of complete parallel universe he creates for himself with this focus on his power and his mastery over this island. And I wouldn't say it's magical realism, but it's a very, it's not based in reality, but the sort of touches where it's close enough to our own world are pretty horrendous. And so the story, early on in the story, we find out that his brother has escaped from somewhere. His older brother, Eric, has escaped and is making his way home and starts calling Frank from phone booths at regular intervals. And we quickly discover that Eric is deeply unwell, very, very mentally ill. Yeah,
he's having pretty much a total break with reality. Like, all of the conversations that he tries to have with Frank on the phone are full of sort of things which are half trolls and half genuine total non sequiturs. And then Eric flies off the handle and smashes up the phone booth, and that's how the phone call ends pretty much every time. Yeah,
and it's the themes of madness and sanity and the worlds that we create throughout are very interesting. And it's this. One of the things that I thought about reading it again were the ideas of all of the realities that we create for ourselves. His dad is he's a former doctor, we discover, and very much was in the hippie movement, is still a vegetarian, which was just an interesting little sidebar, and seems to be completely disinterested in Frank. Eric is taken off him when he's a small child and goes and lives with other family for a while. Frank and his then younger brother, who we discover Frank has actually killed when he was very young, are brought up and sort of left to their own devices. And again, it's that all of them existing in their own worlds, creating this version of reality for themselves in a way that the real world does not seem interested in at all until it becomes impossible to ignore, until it becomes violent. And it's such an interesting, again, that inverse of the idyllic childhood on, we live in a big house on an island, and isn't it wonderful? The inverse of that, where it's we live in a big house on an island, and the reality we create for ourselves is terrifying and violent and painful and distressing. It's extraordinary.
And I mean, you know, the story about Eric is that the reason that he's institutionalized is not because he's so unwell. It's because his illness made him get to a point where he started like menacing the community, and that was kind of a bridge too far, you know. You kind of get the sense that if Eric had gone off the rails in a different direction, that him and Frank might be both kind of spiraling away on the island together.
Yeah, and there's a really poignant bit where Frank is talking about Eric's problem starting when he left. That if he had not left, this wouldn't have happened. But because Eric was too smart and too kind, and he went to medical school where the event happened, that he would have been kept safe. And this idea that the island represents safety, that it represents security, but it represents security and safety in a way that requires constant ritual and constant small animal murder to maintain.
And I mean, one of the points on which Frank is sort of unreliable is that he views the island as being under threat. So as well as the sentinel poles that he's got set up, he's got these incredibly dangerous booby traps that he's rigged in case someone comes to invade. And it's not actually clear that anybody has. He describes having some conflict with some boys in the town at one point, but not ever that it really escalated beyond a point of maybe like there was a skirmish once and now he's death trapped the island just in case forever.
Yeah, carrying a war bag with various projectiles and pyrotechnics and things. And it's interesting in that it doesn't, his voice is not that of someone who is dealing with extreme paranoia or anxiety. There's this very flat as you said, that very matter of fact tone about it, that outside is dangerous, protect from all incomers, make yourself scarce, which has been drilled into him from a very young age, because we find out that his dad never registered his birth, that he has managed to escape the notice of any authorities as to his existence for his entire life, for reasons that become even more nefarious towards the end. And that's, you know, this is how he lives, is just that at some point there will be invaders, at some point there will be danger, and this is how I protect myself from it, through the inflicting of appalling injuries.
Yeah, and the willingness to do that if need be. It's interesting because he's not completely isolated. Like there's a shopkeeper where he buys his various implements of destruction, with whom he has like not a close but a very cordial relationship, and he has precisely one friend in the town, who's this guy with dwarfism, who he takes to punk gigs and lets sit on his shoulders so he can see the band.
Yeah, and I love the character of Jamie, and this guy who sounds like half the guys that I met in the pub at gigs in my early 20s. You know, he comes across as being pretty genuine, pretty easygoing. We don't really understand what it is about Frank that he sees as a friend, but he's a very loyal friend. There's a scene in there where they're in the pub and Frank gets horribly drunk, and Jamie, who seems to have no problem with the ladies as well, clearly the East Coast, a very liberal place towards diversity in the early 80s.
That's right. I mean, he's successfully chatting up a woman from Frank's shoulders while Frank is becoming kind of increasingly the worse for wear, which must have been, like, if you imagine that from the woman's perspective, that's completely insane.
Yeah. But he gets, and his descriptions of teenage drunkenness were so on, again, see, reading this book at the time where I was starting to discover the joys and horrors of binge drinking really hit home, that suddenly your brain is conjuring up the most disgusting food it can think of. And there's a bit where he describes himself as being half piss and half vomit. And I thought, yeah, that's such a getting too drunk when in your teens. But he sort of runs away from them in that shuffly, pathetic way that people run when they're very drunk. And Jamie doesn't even think about it and goes after him. So he's this lovely, loyal friend. He takes him home afterwards. He's there stroking his hair while he throws up, and then takes him back to his mum, and they have a cup of tea, and then Frank feels better and goes home. And he's just this real, he's the most normal character in it. And one of the things that I find interesting is this, he's clearly capable of having friends and maintaining friendships, but chooses not to, sort of like always keeps back that part of himself and chooses this isolation and this inner life. And it's such an interesting, what we hear from him in terms of this friendship and how he presents himself. You know, they're in the pub on an afternoon playing Space Invaders and having a pint, and it all looks very normal. And his inner world, which is full of signs and portents and ritual and this very dark worldview that he has. And it's that, there's that, you can imagine a different version of this kid who grows up to be, you know, he's a smart guy. He's got a lot going for him, that, you know, the other roads that could have been taken. And I think that's part of the poignancy for me, is that he deserves better. And by extension, the people that he killed deserve better too.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think we will continue with this line of conversation in just a second. We are around about at the halfway point, so we are going to take a brief break for station messages, and we will be back right after this.
This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai irarangi te motu, MPR.
And we're back. You're listening to Reserved Recommendations on Manawatu People's Radio today, o Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. This show is produced with the support of New Zealand On Air, so cheers for that, guys. I am talking to Ross Palethorpe about the 1984 novel The Wasp Factory by Iain Banks. You were just talking before the break about how there is this kind of, I guess, this sort of melancholy in the other version of Frank that could have existed if he had been supported and connected in different ways. I guess another thought that I had about Frank as a character is, and this is, I guess, having met more people and discovered more things about how they function, is that in some ways Frank also reads, as well as having this very strange inner world, which has, as we say, sort of curdled, he reads sort of neurodiverse in some ways. Like, he's very particular about wearing very specific clothes and dealing with them in very specific ways. He eats a very limited number of things, which is a thing that he has an ongoing fight with his father about. You know, that stuff I wouldn't necessarily have received in the same way when I read it the first time.
Yeah, and I think there is that, in the same way that when people tend to specifically and overtly write characters who are autistic or have ADHD or some other neurodivergence, it's very flattened, it's very stereotypical. But when it's written in a sort of coded way, or maybe even I don't know if that was something that Banks was considering at the time, but there's that nuance there, and there's certainly those aspects of it. But I think there's some really interesting things in there about gender, about family. Frank talks, one of the chapters starts off with, the two things I hate most in the world are women and the sea. And he talks about how women are evil and weak and aren't worth anything. There's this idea that men are born and designed to kill, where women are born and designed to give life. He hates his mother, both for abandoning him and also for what happens when she comes back to give birth to Paul. And I think now is the time to talk about the dog.
I think so. I mean, absolutely. The dog has a sort of like, not sort of. It has a literally totemic presence in that he has the skull of the actual dog and uses it as a sort of magical totem object. But part of Frank's deal is that as a very young child, he was maimed by the family dog, which is, I'm be careful with my words, which is presumed to have castrated him. And part of his deal with masculinity and violence is that he sort of feels like because he's been cut off from one element of masculinity, he has to completely embrace the other part. And so he sort of sees like masculinity is fertility and murder, and he can't have fertility, so he has to have nothing but murder.
Yeah. And the scene where, and this is where, like I say, it becomes this horrendous Gothic fairy tale, where the moment that his mother has arrived back on the island, 8.5 months pregnant by somebody, and lays up in the house for 2 weeks. And while she is in labor with Frank's younger brother, the dog attacks Frank and mutilates him at the moment that the younger brother is born, which is why in Frank's mind his younger brother must die, because the dog has old Saul is reincarnated in his brother Paul, which, as he points out, is sort of a biblical illusion and his dad's idea of a terrible joke. And so there's this really strong, he's got this really strong concept of masculinity, which he's kind of designing from first principles. You know, the only woman in his life is the housekeeper who comes along every Saturday. And we never really find out how much she knows or how invested she is, whether she ever shows Frank any kind of softness or comfort. He doesn't seem to think of her as a person. He talks about her as being sexless in the way the very young and the very old are. But the fact that she was a woman at some point disgusts him. And his very violent rejection of any kind of femininity or softness. You know, he hates his body. He feels like he should be thin and lean and muscular the way that, you know, given how much exercise he does, he feels he deserves to look, and he sort of describes himself as being quite pudgy and quite soft, which he hates and despises. And then, which he chalks up to the fact that he thinks being castrated. And as the book, because it's a short book, it's 160 pages, as it sort of, and there's not a page wasted. It's such a, even in this first book, and you think about the size of some of Iain Banks, particularly Iain M. Banks novels, and they're vast, and they're these sprawling galactic space operas and everything else. But this is just, it's pared to the bone. And as it goes on, and we get this creeping sense of unease and horror as Eric, the brother, is getting closer and closer, and the signs and portents that Frank is seeing are getting worse and worse, and there's an increasing sense of dread. And in the 10th chapter, we find out what happened to his brother, and this was the bit that made me throw the book across the room. And I'm not going to read it word for word because it is truly horrendous. But he's gone.
It's probably the single gnarliest piece of horror writing that I have read, I would say. It is certainly one of the most haunting body horror images that I have ever encountered. Yeah,
and I think what I get every time I read it, I say I've read this book multiple times, I can feel myself really sort of hoping that I'm going to read something else, which is the mark of how good that scene is. I say good, how affecting that scene is. And the thing that gets me is that there's this it brushes against these larger themes of, even in the 80s, a medical system, a health system that is straining at the seams, that cannot cope, of this poor registrar deep in the belt. He sort of describes the moment where he sees what he sees, and it's with the weight of the city and the oppression bearing down on him in the bowels of this hospital. And
in fact, I think I'm remembering this rightly, one of the details about the incident is that Eric's not actually supposed to be at work. Like he's taken somebody else's shift because, well, Frank chalks it up to Eric being too kind for his own good. But I mean, between the lines, the implication is that, the system is fraying under the weight of neglect and underfunding. And so other people can't cope and Eric has to step in, basically. Yeah.
And one of the most, I say, I'm not going to do spoilers for a 30-year-old book. Well, 40-year-old now. But, oh my Lord. But there's a bit where Nurse finds him after what he has seen and calmly fixes everything up. And there's this sentence of whether she was holding back her own horror or whether she had just seen things like this before or worse. Frank's like, I don't know. But there's something about the way that the ward that he is on is treated, the way it's all breaking down, that sort of creates this moment of absolute revulsion and sort of mind-shattering horror. It's horrifying. It's horrifying in its filthiness and its disgustingness, but also the sense of banality that people are not treated well in our system.
Well, absolutely, because again, without getting too much into the details, you can go and read the book yourself and have this awful experience, which is worth having. But the key thing about where Eric is working is it's kind of the no hope ward. It's where patients who are in some sort of condition that they're not able to look after themselves in any way and they're not expected to improve are just kind of shunted to thrive or die but without really any intervention from anyone who can do anything about it.
Yeah, it's a palliative care ward for children and babies, and there's something very, very poignant and very sad about that, because that would, having been at York Hill Children's Hospital as a child myself, I got, again, that real sense of place, this idea of Glasgow as being this oppressive, painful place to live. And the book does not stay there very long at all, and it's told in this sort of memory that Frank has of being told this. So it's, again, that narration sort of really gives that sense of place. It's and again, the system has completely missed that Frank exists, even though the police officer has been to the house numerous times to interview Frank after these kids have died in these various horrible ways when he himself was a child. Nobody seems to care. Or the story is that he's an orphan and he gets shunted around various members of the family while they decide what to do with him. And that real sense of systemic and social neglect is really, it's a deep undercurrent to the book, but it's a very important one.
Yeah, because, I mean, one of the ways in which Frank's dad is abusive is that he's sort of like just randomly absent. He goes off on these trips and Frank doesn't have any real sense of what he's doing or why. And so he's, as well as we find out being, a nefarious figure of mystery, he's sort of this remote figure of mystery. And kind of everyone except for Jamie that Frank has contact with, is kind of like that.
Yeah. There's lots of, Frank has the Wasp Factory, which is another one of these bizarre, very intricate Rube Goldberg shrines that he uses for divining the future in the attic, which he figures is safe because his dad has had an accident and can't walk very well, and his dad has the study which he has never once been able to get into, and the family secrets, the sort of half-truths, the things that are not talked about, which is a really extreme version of what happens in so many families. We don't, the stories that get told and the ones that don't, the version of events that is the palatable one versus the one that is more accurate but more painful and is therefore hidden. Like, there's a real sense of that isolation from the people who are closest to you, because what the truth is so painful and can't be talked about.
Which is interesting because, like, as far as himself and his own motivations, Frank has like this weird level of insight. He talks about, his problems with women. He talks about how there's like an inner voice that he has, which is quite racist, and he's quite conscious of his racist impulse being a thing that he has to be aware of and also counteract. There's a wonderful paragraph in there, and this, I remember again reading it as a teenager and really connecting with it. He sort of talks about how he imagines he must be quite racist, but only because he's not met anyone who's not white, because there aren't many. And he sort of talks about how when he sees colored people, as he calls them in the book, he really hopes that they will ask him something so that he can be very nice and polite, so that they can see that he is a good person and that he's not giving in to ignorance. And I found that very funny, because growing up in a small town in the west coast of Scotland, I didn't meet a black person in person until I was in my early teens, and had a conversation with someone, and that real shutting off from the world in this. Well, I imagine I'm quite racist, but I really do. I'm mindful that it comes from ignorance, and I hope I'm better than that. Just those little bits of self-awareness are so, and it's such a 16-year-old thing to think as well. Well, yeah, I mean, it's almost like that thing that many boys go through about, like, what if I'm gay and I just don't know it yet? And the answer is, if you are, you'll know. You'll figure it out. It's not something that you can be that's completely secret from yourself. And that idea that I could have these awful impulses that even I don't know about. In therapeutic practice, we have something that's called the Johari window, which is this idea that there are things about ourselves that we know about ourselves and that other people know too. There are things that I'm going to sound very George Bush era, like there's the known unknowns, but there's the parts of ourselves that other people do not see. There's parts of ourselves that other people see that maybe we are ignorant to, and then there's like the very dark, sort of deep part of ourselves that remains hidden both within and without. And I think that a lot of his thoughts and his feelings sort of really sit, he's sort of, his name is whispered as a bit of a curse among the local people, Frank will get you. So he has this idea that nobody knows that he kills small animals, that nobody knows that he's this, blows things up and is very weird. But obviously that people are seeing that or responding to it in some way. He thinks he's terribly clever and terribly subtle in a way that I imagine most 16-year-olds think they are, but of course other people can see differently. And then there's the part of himself that other people know about that he certainly does not, which is the second big reveal in the book. And one of the reasons why I sort of reached out to talk about this book is that, is that at the end of the book, we find out that Frank has not actually
been castrated, that he was born female, that his dad saw the opportunity to raise him as a boy after this horrible incident with the dog. And the moment of realization of Frank's gender, and I'm using he, him pronouns throughout because that's how it is used throughout the book, that reading that at the time, I was absolutely knocked sideways by it. And it's quite impressive to have a book that's 160 pages that like knocks you twice in a row. Reading it again post my own transition was an interesting experience.
Yeah, I mean, one must be cautious of saying you wouldn't do that these days. But the way in which it deals with gender is, I think, in some ways quite of its time. It's not without empathy, but there is a very there's a pre all of the public conversations about transness that we have had quality to it.
Yeah. And it's very interesting reading this through the lens of someone who has gone through a gender transition themselves as an adult. And he discovers this very late on. His dad has sort of constructed this reality for him, raised him as a boy. There's a bit towards the end where his dad is very drunk, which never normally happens, and he's apologizing and, this was an experiment and I'm so sorry. And he's sort of left with this, what do I do now with my life? Like, who am I? And I was really struck by this. I personally do not think that the book is transphobic, and I don't think it's trying to say anything about being transgender. I think it's trying to say something about how we're raised, about family, about secrets, about place. I think Banks sort of uses this reveal in quite it's written from a very cis male perspective. And when you think about the culture novels, which have this real people change gender all the time, they're very expansive. I think Iain had some great ideas about this. He's really road testing some extremes in this book. But I think for me, it's sort of, there's an interesting point. We never find out what happens to Frank past that. The sort of book ends with him sort of, Frank is actually Francis. The boy is a girl. And what does this mean? So it's that, does Frank continue taking the hormones that his dad has been slipping him for the last few years? Does he continue to live as Frank? Does he embrace this understanding of his new gender? Like, what were the options for someone in the early 80s in this remote part of the east coast of Scotland? Probably not extensive. But when you find that out about the character and reread it, and the way that he talks about women and femininity and everything else, there's such I find it fascinating. I remember reading lots of books that had things to say about gender growing up and throughout my life. I transitioned as an adult, and it was one of those, that the thing that is hidden, it took me a long time to realize that this was the thing that was missing in my life that would make me happy and make me feel fulfilled. And it's such an interesting idea of like, it's that really interesting inverse. We have this whole right-wing talking point now of how people are trying to make the kids transgender, and this book sort of is a sort of real Gothic horror of what that would be like in practice and what it would take in order to do that, and how fantastical it is. It's completely ridiculous. The idea that you could,
and I mean it's. It's part of So I had two thoughts again. On the one hand, it's part of the sort of the hippie utopianism thing is that it depends entirely on trickery. Frank's dad has set himself up as this sort of wizard-like figure who can tell all of these things about what Frank's done in the town. And it turns out that actually he's just either been paying or otherwise bribing people to tell him what Frank is up to so that he can be omniscient all the time. And so he's trying this sort of total reality control experiment on Frank. And the gender stuff is part of that, like, can I completely define this kid's world for them thing. The other thing that I discovered in doing a little bit of sideways reading and discovering some people asking Iain Banks questions about this was that one of the things that Iain Banks said that he was trying to do was to look at the way that sort of adventure masculinity was defined in fiction and to try and parody and interrogate that in some ways. And so some of Frank's gender stuff is about, I guess, finding a standpoint where you can try and look at that sort of masculinity almost from like 1 foot in and 1 foot out.
Yeah. And the character of Frank with his violence and his self-sufficiency and everything else, and looking at this book again in 2025, there's so much of Frank that is attractive to a 16-year-old boy. Here's a kid who literally gets away with murder, who has free reign to do whatever he wants, who hates women, who is
brewing his own booze under his bed.
Brewing his own booze under the bed is prepping for the end of the world. I mean, there's a version of this book where the gender reveal doesn't happen at the end, and this is held up the way that Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club is completely misunderstood by the vast majority of people who read it, But the rug pull at the end, where this very warped epitome of survivalism and masculinity has been born female, but raised male and kept isolated and everything else, it really, you do not see it coming, even on a reread. And like I say, I've read it quite a few times. It's not one of these that it's such a surprise that it doesn't make any sense, but there's very few clues in the text.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess what he's trying to do is pull the rug out from under Frank at the same time as the reader, and so kind of undermine Frank's understanding of himself at the same time as he undermines the reader's idea of what's been going on this whole time.
Yeah, and I think there's also an element of, this is a kid who is homeschooled, who is kept isolated, who is hidden away from the world, in which there is an increasing number of Christian evangelicals and people who are very right-wing, who have this real, any kind of sex and relationship education is bad. In fact, I was reading the evening that we are recording that the government has removed the sex and relationship education guidelines. Thanks very much for that, guys. But if Frank had understanding of anatomy and of like his own body and relationship changes, like, this is not something that would have got past him. The ignorance that he is kept in, the complete control of various aspects of his life that his dad has over him, and the complete disinterest that his dad has in other aspects of his life, mean that he's being experimented on and he has no idea. And it really is a parable of the dangers of that kind of social isolation and the control that can be wielded by an adult over a child.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, the dark heart of hippie utopianism is how many people went and started communes and then started marrying 11-year-olds, and it's not by any means only a hippie thing. Plenty of evangelical Christians did that and various other people. But, that urge to have a pocket reality which is completely under your control is just so close to all of those other really awful urges, you know?
Yeah, and there's a mentioned a couple of times earlier in the book that Eric, the older brother, was being dressed as a girl by his dad when he was very little, and that's why he was sent away. So clearly the dad has got this long-standing, very vested interest, not necessarily in gender in and of itself, but gender expression and presentation as a form of control, which, again, looking at this in 2025 is really quite unsettling. I don't think that's something that Banks was really considering as a larger theme, as you said, like his interpretation of it being that subversion of that action man teenager role, but it's there, and I think it's very prescient in its way. And as a parable, as a really dark fairy tale, it bears reading. I do recommend it. I recommend it with a please do not read while you are eating. Please do not read if you have a sensitive disposition, but it stays with you. And having read quite a lot of Iain Banks and Iain M. Banks stuff, it is the book of his that I keep coming back to.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say the blessing and the curse of it is that it is, like you say, it's absolutely pared to the bone, which means that you can read it in a day or two. And the risk with that is that that's sort of the book equivalent of drinking half a bottle of whiskey at once. Like you get a lot of very intense book very quickly. And so if you're susceptible to that as a reader, then beware of it, because it will creep up on you. But yes, I would with the reservation that, you know, if you are sensitive about people doing terrible things to animals or body horror generally, or just squeamish or any of those things, tread with caution. But yeah, it absolutely will stay with you. And I'm a fan of Iain Banks, but like you say, none of his other books have really got their hooks in me in quite that way. Yeah,
he's very good at the very, you know, I think the Crow Road starts with, you know, that was the day that my granny exploded. Like he's got a very dry sense of humor. He's got a very sharp wit. He's got such a keen sense of imagining. I was very sad when he died, mainly because of his writing in this. I'm a big fan of the culture novels as well. Again, I tend to need a couple of run-ups to them to really get into them, but
the culture can be quite dense, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that there is something, you know, if he'd written The Wasp Factory and stopped, it would still be an important novel for particular people. It is unpleasant. It makes no apology for that. The early editions had in fact, I think most of the editions, I've got a lovely old secondhand copy here. I did for a long time have the copy that I bought as a teenager, which was covered in my notes and in the margins and things from when I wrote this. I wish I had a copy of the report. I would love to go back and see what I thought about it at that age. But it has a mixture of the good reviews that the book's got and the bad reviews. So it really wears its heart on its sleeve, in that some people thought it was incredible and some people absolutely hated it. And some people thought it was incredible and absolutely hated it. And I admire that. I think as well, when so much of the media that we consume is it's going for the middlest of roads. There's that real, not even fear of offending. I don't think it's that. I don't think that cancel culture is something we need to worry about here, but there's that reluctance of big companies to take the left field, to make a real spin. I don't think he would have been picked up by a big publisher for this today, for example. No,
absolutely. I think this is the sort of thing that he would have had to self-publish. And I think, part of why it is the way it is that it was his first novel, and so in lots of ways he had everything to prove and nothing to lose, and it is very much that kind of, fucking look at this, see what you think. kind of, it's a statement. And it was the story of its publication is that it bounced around a number of publishers and was eventually pulled out of what was called a slush pile, which is like a collection of unsolicited submissions that people go through at their leisure to see if there's anything in there. And I suspect that the decision to publish it was, the subject of some discussion internally within the publisher before it got there,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And they went for it, and like I say, the really quite puckish decision to go with, like I say, some of the reviews are absolutely glowing. What a singular talent, what a brilliant, fertile imagination. With, this book should be burned and the man who wrote it put in stocks. And it's like I say, a singular talent and a real. There's a warmth there. I say, to come back to what we were saying at the top, he's created this grotesque, not just protagonist, but this grotesque gallery of characters in this book. And there's no escaping the horror. There's no hiding from what they have done and continue to do to each other. But throughout, there is a level of empathy and humanity in each one, which I think a lesser writer would have missed. Again, I said earlier about Chuck Palahniuk, and I've read quite a few of his books as well. When I was in my early 20s and everyone was looking at Fight Club in the wrong way, he writes grotesque characters as well without that shred, without any empathy. You think they're assholes because they're assholes. Frank is very relatable even in his grotesqueness. And I think that is such a fine needle to thread to make that work, and he did.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really remarkable. And normally I do a what else would you recommend? But the Wasp Factory is such a singular and weird thing that honestly I think if you want to read it, then read it. But I cannot really think of anything else that has that same kind of impact and that plays in that kind of space.
Yeah, I've never read anything like it, and I'm not sure I want to. No, once is enough. I mean, we've both revisited this book, and I had reread it a number of times before rereading it again so I could talk to you about it. But I don't know that I need a lot of them, as you say. Yeah, and I mean, and I think this is a tell. Like I say, there are people who've read it multiple times, and there's people who get a couple of chapters in and never pick it up again because they're horrified by it. And you know what? Fair enough. But very early on, very shortly after I met my now partner, my now husband, I gave him a copy of this book. I was like, look, we were at that stage of giving each other meaningful presents. And I remember giving him, I went and bought a copy of The Wasp Factory and gave it to him. And I was like, this is a very important book to me. And I remember him reading it and going back and go, what the fuck is this? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But, that was not enough to make him run for the hills. And that was a good 11, 12 years ago. So, a bold strategy on my part, but it seemed to pay off. But yeah, a really remarkable book in all the ways that you can think of the word remarkable as meaning, from a singular talent. We'll not see his like again. And a real delight to go back to it. As I say, every time I go back, I take something new from it. I get a little bit deeper into it. It's not a place I want to stay for long. It's not something I want to revisit that often, but every time I do, I discover something new about it. And I think that's the mark of a really extraordinary bit of work. Yeah, absolutely. And look, if you have listened to this conversation and thought, this Iain Banks character sounds like a fascinating author, but I'm genuinely not sure I can stomach this thing that they're talking about, read other Iain Banks novels. They range from somewhat grotesque to not really that grotesque,
but there is always some element of that real human insight, and it kind of doesn't matter how grounded or how weird he's getting. He always manages to have that thing, even when he's talking about like telepathic conversations between impossibly intelligent spaceships in the deepest reaches of space.
Yeah. He always, even in the most bizarre, out there space operas, there's this grounding in empathy and humanity, even when we're not talking about humans, which I think is truly impressive. He was he was a superb writer, and by all accounts a really decent human being with some excellent politics as well, I may say.
And all three of those at once are, it turns out, increasingly tricky to come by. Well, look, thank you so much for talking this evening. This has been a wonderful conversation. The Wasp Factory is one of those things where, like you say, it's so deeply impactful, but you can't just talk to anybody about it because it's a little bit like saying, would you like to see my collection of bottled guinea pigs or something, you know?
Yeah. It's a real, it's a very Marmite book in that you do not feed it to children for lunch. And it's a real, you love it or you hate it, or you have very complex feelings about it, but you can't pick it up and then forget about it.
No, you cannot be neutral on the Wasp Factory. Look, thank you so much, Ross. Do you have anything that you would like to plug yourself, aside from like whatever you can do to resist the government? Please do. They're a pack of wankers.
It's tough out there. Yeah, you can find me on Blue Sky at Ross These Days. bsky.social or whatever it is that they use on that. And that's pretty much it. It's been a real pleasure talking this through with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's always a great time coming on Reserved Recommendations. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes of this show at npr.nz/show/reserved on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me at Objective Reality on Blue Sky, or send emails to objectivereality@gmail.com. You can also follow Reserved Recommendations on Facebook or Instagram. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.